Spider-Man had some major success within the last few years, especially recently. He had his popularity hit the high marks with Spider-Man No Way Home. Spawned a very critically acclaimed animated movie, even though, yeah, it's about a different Spider-Man, but that's beside the point. But still, spawned an awesome animated movie. Saw very high success of the successful sequel to Homecoming, which was Far From Home, which I gotta say was for a long time one of my favorite Spider-Man films, still is to this day. Had a critically acclaimed return when it came to Spider-Man Homecoming after he appeared in that film I don't want to talk about or bring up because fuck that film, but he had an epic return to theaters in 2017. Had a very awesome reboot with the Amazing Spider-Man movie, and depending on how you think about this movie, you do have to agree with me that it was a pretty awesome and successful film, even spawning an awesome and successful sequel. Had a pretty good success, but not a successful film in 2007 with Spider-Man 3. Still was pretty good, not as great as it could have been. And had a highly successful, critically acclaimed sequel in 2004. But in order to appreciate all these good films, we need to go back, way back, to 2002. Imagine, if you will, a young boy of 7. I know, I'm a baby in that picture, right? Next to my dad and grandfather, the hierarchy of supremacy male in the family. And yeah, I do have my tongue sticking out. That still would not be adorable today, or would it be? Anyways, I grew up with Spider-Man, specifically Spider-Man, the animated series from the 90s, and Spider-Man, sorry, and Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends from the 80s that I grew up on. But the picture of Spider-Man being on a big screen was something we could only dream of. It was something that every fan wanted to see the major superhero up on the big screen. Just to give you a point of view, I did grow up with superhero films at the time. I grew up with the successful films such as the Christopher Reeve Superman, Batman, the 1989 film, The Crow, as well as I should mention Batman Returns, and also Godzilla. But I did want to really have that Spider-Man movie, and well, my prayers were answered in 2002. Imagine, if you would, a young boy watching SpongeBob back in 2002. Nothing specific or fantastic, it's SpongeBob, and everybody loves SpongeBob. But then you see this.
Choice to live an ordinary life is no longer an option.
Which came out May 3rd, 2002. That was 20 years ago, and the trailer just blew my mind. So in order to talk about every other movie, this will be coming out 20 years pretty soon. Same with this one, eventually this one, eventually this one, eventually this one, eventually that one, and eventually No Way Home will too. But we have to go back to the past, to the one that started it all. So yes, my friends, I'm going to review the original Spider-Man from 2002 to celebrate and honor its 20-year legacy. The movie opens up with some beautiful visual effect and also that awesome score by the one and only Danny Elfman. The movie officially opens upon the city of New York, New York, which has changed a lot in the last 20 years. We're introduced to Tobey Maguire, who monologues over what's going on behind the scenes for the audience, including talking about Mary Jane Watson being with Flash Thompson, and he's Mr. Boss. Ah, yes, the old running after the bus routine, and even the bus driver was in on it. Jesus Christ, what a dick. If it wasn't for Mary Jane, he probably would have ran over Peter, and this movie would have been darker a lot quicker. This is where we get introduced to all the characters. Peter, the shy, awkward, nerdy kid who's being raised by an aunt and uncle. Mary Jane is a popular girl who never recognizes him, even though he sincerely loves her. And also we are introduced to the Oddborn family. Norman, played by Willem Dafoe, and Harry, played by James Franco, and both are phenomenal in this film. They go to the laboratory of Dos Ex Machina. I'm not even kidding. They go to a freaking science lab, which is something that the Amazing Spider-Man copied as well. So Peter tried to take pictures and be good, but everybody seemed to be picking on him because nerd. That is when a real-life spider crawls upon Tobey Maguire. Yes, seriously, that is a real-life spider that they painted. But the spider that they used to bite him is CGI'd because they were afraid of Mr. Maguire being poisoned. So the spider bites him and it's off to the races. We see Norman as a successful high businessman working with the military to work under some project. What project in specifically? The Green Goblin, but of course it's not told that. But everything's going down the toilet for dear Norman as the general finds out that he's working for. The general's not pleased with Norman and tells him to get off the project and get the fuck out of his army, 'cause he's not worthy to serve in the corps. We're then greeted by my favorite versions of Aunt May and Uncle Ben, played brilliantly by Cliff Robertson, who is a Western star, and Rosemary Harris. These are the two I think of every time somebody mentions the name Aunt May and Uncle Ben. They are brilliant in this film, and they're both brilliant actors in their own right, and both bring out the best in this role, and especially Cliff Robertson, who would be in brief cameos for the other two films. Peter goes to sleep and Norman decides to try out the experiment for himself. I can see nothing go wrong here. His assistant tells him that he should not be doing this, but Norman says once you go into hell, there is no way out of it. Sort of like the birth of a monster, so to speak, and especially that this was made by Sam Raimi, the same guy who made Evil Dead, Army of Darkness, and Darkman. This says a lot, but the transformation sequence is so iconic, it needs to speak for itself. Peter then wakes up, realizing that puberty hit him like a bus. Yesterday he was weakling, today he is world's strongest man in all of Russia, duh. So he takes it as just something that happened to him, and basically let's just play it off as puberty for fate's sakes. But Petey ain't the only one going through some changes, as Norman is as well, as Harry runs home to find him collapsed on the floor, but he can't remember the night before. This is because he's being taken over by the form and his mind that's simply known as Goblin. But Peter notices his changes as well when he tries to fight Flash Thompson over a mistake that happens in the lunchroom. Mary Jane tried to get Harry to help, but Peter thinks that he seemed to be handling himself quite well, truth be told, as Flash tried to beat him up, but Peter ends up defeating him. But Peter soon realizes that he has more power than he knows what to do with, as he ends up doing what's best, jumping across rooftops. Yes, seemingly I would be very afraid to be doing this, but good for him, good for Peter. He deserves a thumbs up for doing his best. Where we get another infamous scene with lines of infamy. Just watch.
Fly! Up and away with! Shazam! Go! Go! Go, Web, go!
Peter decides to go after MJ by getting a car and designing his own costume, because he wants to be a wrestler and win money so he can impress Mary Jane. So he tries to do so, with a product placement by Diet Dr. Pepper. No thanks. I'm a Diet Pepsi man myself. Dr. Pepper tastes like shit. You've heard it here. Product placement aside, Peter has his heart-to-heart talk with Uncle Ben, who's worried about him and worried about the man that he'll become. Peter tells him not to worry, that he's just going through some phases and changes and he'll figure it out by himself. But his uncle wants to be with him and tells him, with great power comes great responsibility, in the words of Stan Lee, and Peter flips out. Not to Bonesaw, played by the one and only Macho Man Randy Savage. Ooh yeah! And the wrestling professional, played by the one and only Bruce Campbell, who is a good friend of Sam Raimi, so of course he'd be in this too. But there's another cameo most people don't know about. Octavia Spencer as the wrestling sign-up woman. To know that this woman would go on to be an Academy Award winning actor and one of my favorite actresses, just to have this small role must have meant so much to her and leading up to her career. So God bless Octavia Spencer. This leads into a cage match that Peter had no idea was coming, and he tells him to take the chains off as we get another infamous line from the Macho Man himself.
Freak show! You're going nowhere! I got you for 3 minutes! 3 minutes up! Tea time!
Peter ends up beating the Macho Man, but it's told by the wrestling referee he was supposed to pin him in 2 minutes to win about $3,000, I think it was. But the wrestling manager tells him that he pinned him not in the time limit that was supposed to happen and tells him to fuck off. But he gets robbed as we come to one of my favorite moments, even though, yes, there are 1,000 memes on it. It's one of my favorite moments when Peter discovers that his uncle has been shot, and just in one short scene says everything. This drives Peter into an enragement when he watches his uncle die in his own hands, and he ends up going after the thief who he thinks did it. But just look at his eyes in this moment. Not only are they filled up with tears, they're filled up with rage. He's had enough, and he's going out for vengeance. So he goes after the thief who begs him to give him a chance, but Peter sees nothing but vengeance. And in a very good scene, he sees his face and recognizes who he is. But does this mean that he's gonna let him live? Absolutely not. In a freak accident, the guy falls out of the window, but Peter blames himself for it, as the dude is pronounced dead at the scene of the crime. This leads into another heartfelt, touching speech between Tobey Maguire and Rosemary Harris that serves the point of it, that he wanted Peter to be the young man that he saw himself as when he was younger. Just wanted him to kind of, in a way, follow in his footsteps, very similar to a father. Peter disgraces this and said that he argued with him and he shouldn't have, and Aunt May tells him, what's in the past is in the past, it's time to move on, Petey. Peter takes his words to heart and becomes the superhero icon known only as Spider-Man. In a brief montage scene, we get to see him, saving New York City and beating up criminals who deserve it. We're introduced to the one and only J.K. Simmons as J. Jonah Jameson. Jameson hates everything that Spider-Man encounters, and J.K. Simmons really encaptured the vision of who J. Jonah Jameson is and does a phenomenal job. He's easily the best part of the trilogy. You learn that Peter moved in with Harry in their own little tiny apartment, where they're then visited by Norman Oddborn, who tells them about some good news that he had for them, including a job offer for both Peter and Harry. Peter decides, fuck the job, I want to be a photographer. So he tried to go up to J.K. Simmons, who turned the entire town of New York, or city, against him to the best of his advantage, because the words of the press are more important than the words of the people. But things don't turn out well for Norman either, as he realizes that the board had turned against him.
Started this company. You know how much I sacrificed?
Then we get to the famous Manhattan Square Showdown, where the Goblin shows up and just wreaks unimaginable havoc upon everybody. To be fair, that this is a good place to have Spider-Man versus the Goblin and have them to meet for the very first time. This whole scene is just chaos incarnate between both the Goblin and Peter, Spider-Man, and it's just outright crazy, but I think that's what makes it so great, is that they just envelop the craziness that's just going on at that point. Man ends up ruining a date, or a marriage proposal, as he saves Mary Jane as she wants to know who he is, but he just tells her that he's a friendly neighborhood Spider-Man and swings off to Eversville. This is where we get to one of my favorite moments, when Willem Dafoe does a great job at being both the Goblin and Norman Oddborn. This is a brilliant scene and brilliantly crafted by both Sam Raimi and Willem Dafoe, showing him that what he's become, and now he's no longer alone, but the Goblin lives in his head, deep down, and it can escape whenever it feels like it, much to the fear of Norman. This leads into an interesting speech by both the Goblin and Peter. The Goblin telling Peter that he should not be a superhero because people do not like him. Peter says that he's just doing it to defend the public, and basically the Goblin says one of the most infamous lines in the whole movie.
Of everything you've done for them, eventually they will hate you. Why bother?
Very interesting line to bring up in the movie. If, despite of everything that he done for them, they hate him, but why does he keep doing it? Peter says because he wants to. I think it's because Peter owned it to his uncle after dying that he should become a hero and save everybody. But the Goblin hates this and wants him to work with him. This goes for a brilliant villain-hero chemistry. Leads into the infamous scene where Petey, SpiderMan, ends up saving Mary Jane. And there's also another reason why this scene is so infamous. Not the powerful kiss, but there's another interesting moment why this scene is so famous. And I have to bring it up. Kirsten Dunst has a nipple slip. Enough said, that's all I need to say is right there. Anyways, the Goblin attacks Peter in a burning building and decides now would be the perfect moment to kill him, but guess what? Petey ends up escaping, but which leads into an infamous scene where Peter ends up getting caught, and the Goblin thinks that he has him, but truthfully, he did not. Leads into the infamous Thanksgiving scene where he realizes and notices the scar on Peter's hand, asking him how he did it. Peter proclaimed it was a bike messenger who knocked him down, but he knows the truth. Peter is Spider-Man, and now since he knows his secret, he can use it against him. So while praying over a picture of her dead husband, what did the Goblin do? Why, he does what every asshole would do, attacks Aunt May at home and threatens her to finish her prayer. Aunt May survives, but basically she had either a heart attack or a panic attack, and tells Peter that she knows he's been talking to Mary Jane and how he feels about her. And much to Peter's confusion, he suddenly realizes how much that he loves Mary Jane, so he decides to go and try to call her. But there's a problem, she's been kidnapped. This is where we see how threatening that the Goblin is. He threatens Spider-Man to save only one or the other. To save Mary Jane, or to save the children that he stole from a cable car. He can't choose both, he has to choose just one. And the Goblin threatens him to choose as he does the most heroic thing imaginable. He ends up saving both, much to the Goblin's disappointment. He wanted him to only choose one, and the one would be his only selection. So in choosing two, the Goblin just ends up becoming mad and growls. Roar! After he saved Mary Jane and the children, the Goblin decides to beat him up in an old abandoned house, and at first the Goblin kicks the shit out of him and tells him what he'll do to his family, and including Mary Jane, because he's so weak and they really bring out his weakness. But Peter uses his weakness, quote-unquote, turns it into a great strength and uses it against the Goblin himself and beats the ever-loving shit out of him in the most glorious fashion ever imagined. But the Goblin, speaking through Norman, tried to convince Peter to let him live because of how much that he knows that he means to Peter. But Peter is not truly convinced and can pretty much see through the little white lies hidden in the cracks of the Goblin's speech. Leads to the Goblin being stabbed by his own glider and telling Peter not to tell Harry who he was or whatever happened to him. The funeral sets up what's gonna happen in Spider-Man 2. Harry telling Peter he will not rest until Spider-Man is destroyed, and Peter and MJ end up sharing a moment together where they end up swearing that they both basically love each other, despite them never saying it.
My curse. Who am I? I'm Spider-Man.
And so, ladies and gentlemen, that is Spider-Man 2002. Is it still worth watching 20 years today? Hell yes. It has a fantastic story, great and amazing characters, an amazing innovative universe, and the Spider-Man costume really pays off to see on the big screen. This was everything that every Spider-Man fan wanted back in 2002, and what's even better is that this movie opened up the floodgates to more Marvel movies. such as the infamous Daredevil that came out the year after, and also X-Men 2, X-Men United that came out a couple years after the original. No matter how you look at it, Spider-Man will still be around 20 years later. Spider-Man opened the Marvel Universe, and maybe it'll end it as well. And despite the many movies that came out after his high success, we all hold our candle to the original. If it wasn't for this movie, I wouldn't be a movie collector, and if it wasn't for this movie, I wouldn't be the big huge nerd that I am to this day. God bless Spider-Man, and happy 20th anniversary.